What if you could send personalized emails to multiple contacts with just one click directly from Excel? Today, we'll go through 7 levels of automation, starting with a simple formula and working up to a full VBA solution that can send emails with Excel ranges and attachments. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to eliminate the hassle of sending emails one by one. Are you ready? On level 1, we'll establish the basics. There's a formula in Excel we can use to create emails, and it will launch the default mail client, which in my case is Outlook. So to send an email, all we need to do is click on this link here, and that opens Outlook with the email, the to field, CC, BCC, subject, and email body. So how does this work? We're going to send the email using the hyperlink function. What we're going to do is build something called a mail to link. So when the user clicks on that link, Excel tells the default mail client to send a new email with the information supplied here. So briefly to explain this, the first part is the to field. This is the CC, then we have the BCC and the subject and the body. After that, there's a little comma here, and then there is the link text. So that's what you see over here in the cell. Let's build the email link for Agent Carter. I'm going to click on this cell where it says link, and then expand the formula bar so we can see all of these cells. Let me just bring this up as well. So let's start from a blank cell. We'll use the hyperlink function, and you'll see that there are 2 parts to it. The first part is link location, and the second part is friendly name. So for the link location, what we want is a mail to link, and to do that, we use quote marks, mail to, colon, quote marks. Now, for clarity, I'm going to enter this on a new line, but you could in fact just continue it on this line like this. But to start on a new line, just for the sake of clarity, I'm going to press Alt and Enter. And that takes us to the next line. So now I'll introduce the to field. I'm going to write and this ampersand, which means we'll join mail to the next part, which is C5. And C5, oh, that was wrong. That was Ethan's. We actually want C6. So that's Agent Carter. And then we need another ampersand with a quote marks and a question mark, end quote marks. Now, Alt Enter for a new line, ampersand, quote marks, ampersand CC equals quote marks. So this bit adds the CC field. Then we're going to go ampersand D6. So that means we want a CC mission control. Now press Alt Enter for another new line, and I'll fill in the rest of these in the same way. And at this point, I'm going to hit Alt Enter again and add in the friendly name that you'll see in the cell. So quote marks, open square bracket, capital L-I-N-K, close square bracket, quote marks, and close that round bracket. Now when I hit Enter, you'll see there's a new link. It's slightly funny in the format. So I'm going to increase the size a little bit and click on link. So we get our email to Agent Carter with the proper details. But now I need to point out that there's a pretty big drawback to using this method. It's actually not very easy to add spaces like this in between lines. So if I head back to Excel, in the body text for Agent Carter, you see there's only 1 line instead of the 3 different lines we saw in Outlook. So in order to get this looking nice and spaced, we need to use %0, capital A, to enter a new line. And if we want a line break followed by another line break, so 2 new lines, we need to do that again. So %0A, %0A. And that's not all. Another problem with this is you can't send more than 1 email at a time. So if I want to send to Ethan and Agent Carter and to Benji, I'll have to click to each of these one at a time. So that isn't the best use of my time. I'd rather be able to click once and send to all of them. On level 2, we'll send multiple emails with a single click. We'll use VBA to automate the process. VBA stands for Visual Basic for Applications. With VBA, we can send 10 or even 100 emails at a time. Let's start with a blank workbook. The first thing to do is right-click on the ribbon here and click Customize the ribbon. We're looking for the Developer tab, which is all the way down here. I'm going to check this box and then click on OK. Now up here, I have the Developer tab. There's a lot of scary looking icons here, and the first time you see this, you might panic. But don't worry. Let's just head over to this button. This says a Visual Basic, and it's a Visual Basic editor. I'll click on this, And up comes the Microsoft Visual Basic for Applications editor. At the moment, it's a big gray box because there's nothing we're editing. But looking at book 1, which is the project we're in, I can then right-click and insert a module. So this is a code module that I can write VBA, that's Visual Basic for Applications, code in. So the first thing I'm going to do is rename this module. I don't want it to be called Module 1. I'm going to replace that with Level 2 and hit Enter. Next, I'll head back to this window, click in it, and I'll start typing SUB for sub-procedure, space, and then the name of the sub-procedure, which in this case will be level _2 _ emails. And I hit Enter. You'll notice that the Visual Basic for Applications editor automatically added these parentheses and also this end sub, which marks the end of the subroutine. So before we write any code, let me just point out that there's this 2 words option explicit at the top. And you might be wondering why we do that. Well, think of this. Here's a box and here's another box. VBA lets us store stuff in these boxes. These boxes are called variables. Let's call this one my box. And let's call this one your box. So we can happily use my box and your box to store stuff inside. But I might accidentally write my books instead of my box. And if I do that, suddenly I'm using a different box. And I might not be able to see the difference if I'm typing this quickly or working on a project that's very long. So when we use option explicit, we're telling VBA that we need to name every box before we use them. And that way, if we accidentally mistype the name of that box, it will flag this up as an error and we can go back and fix it. When we write VBA, it's good practice to indent our lines so it's easy to read. Next, I'm going to write in DIM, which helps us to set up a box. So DIM, that keyword, sets up a box with the name, in this case, email app. I'm going to set it up as a box of type object. So I'm going to say as space, and you'll see this menu pops up with all the options I have. So I start typing O, and then it comes up with object. So I can click on that, and when I hit enter, you'll see it corrects this. So now the blue keywords surround the name of the new box. So our box is called email app, and it can hold objects. Next, we want to do the same for an email item. So how do we start with a new box? It's DIM space, and the name of this one is email item. And again, we need to make this a box of type object. So as object. So as I'm starting to type, I can press tab to autocomplete. So it makes it much faster to enter stuff. So I hit return there. There's a few more lines we're going to declare here. I'll just paste them in for speed and then change this to lineup. So it's very helpful to have these at the top so you can see what boxes or variables we're going to use inside this sub-procedure. We're going to start by outlining our code. We'll use comments to do so. To create a comment, we use a single quote mark followed by the comment. So my first comment is to set up the Outlook application. This gets it ready to send emails. When I hit enter, you'll see it turns green, which means it's a comment, and Excel will just ignore that line. That green thing is just for us to see. I want to specify the data range. We need to tell Excel where to look for the information that goes into the email, the to, the CC, the BCC. Then we're going to find the last row with data. That's important so that we can loop through each of the rows and send the right number of emails. Here comes the important part, which is where we automate emails using the data in the data range. And at the end, we'll do a bit of cleanup. Great, so we've outlined the code, but what happens if we were to close this workbook? We'd lose all this code. We don't want that to happen, do we? So let's save this. We'll go to File, and here's the important part. When I save this, I need to make sure that I save it as a type, not Excel workbook, because that would lose the code. I actually need to save it as an Excel macro-enabled workbook. So the word macro just means a bit of code that we can run to do stuff in Excel. And when I click Save, this code is saved with the workbook. So I've opened a workbook that I prepared earlier. This already has the VBA that we need for level 2. So I'm going to go to the Developer tab, then click on Visual Basic. And in the editor, you'll see I've filled out different lines that give instructions to Excel following the application outline that we made earlier using these green comments. And I added a few more comments here just for clarity. So this line here creates an object which is an Outlook application instance. It's like opening the email client programmatically, so then later it can help us to send messages. These next two lines, set WS, remember that's the variable name, and short for worksheet, set that equal to this workbook.sheets level 2. And level 2 is where our current data is sitting. The next line here, set RNG, which is short for range, equal to WS, which is this workbook sheets level 2. So level 2 and the range is B4. That corresponds to this cell here. We're setting RNG to equal that range to serve as a starting point for reading and processing data. So let me rearrange the windows to make it easier to see what's going on. This is our next line, find the last row with data. And all this is doing is setting this variable, last row, equals to this whole expression. So I won't go into that in detail here, but I'll tell you what it does, which is it goes to the last row in this worksheet, and then it goes all the way up until it finds a row with some values inside it, and then it sets last row equal to that number. So in this case, last row equals 7. So this next bit is the important part for creating our emails. What we've got here is a counter. It's called current row. So we're going to go from the number 1 up to the last row, less the starting row. So we're going to start in this row, then add 1. Then as this thing loops through, we're going to go from row 5 to row 6 and row 7. So we'll send an email for each of these rows. And the way that works is we set this object email item to equal email app.createItem0, which creates a new email. Then with email item, we're going to add some things. So the .to just tells us this property needs to be equal to, and this RNG, we start off here in B4, and we're going to offset it. How many rows will offset it is this row counter, and how many columns is this number here. So we start in B4, then we offset it with 1 row, and then we offset it with 1 column. So this is what's going into the to field over here. The same for the CC field. We start with B4, we go down a row, then we go across 2 columns, and this is what's in CC. And it's the same for BCC, which is an offset of 3 columns, and subject, which is an offset of 4 columns, and body, which is an offset of 5 columns. And after that, we do this thing, which is email item.display. This is called a method. What it does, it creates an action to display this email. Now, instead of displaying it, we could actually send the email if we change this to send. But I prefer displaying the email first so that I can check each email before I click send. And our last 2 lines just set the email item to nothing and the email app to nothing, which is a good practice for clearing this out of memory. And after that, we finish. Now, before we get to send emails, let me just show you what's in the body text. So I'm going to drag the formula bar down. And you'll notice, if you've been sharp, that I can actually do this differently from when we were doing formulas. So if I go back to level 1, and I go back to the body, do you remember when we had to insert a new line, we had to use this funny thing, %0a, and then another one for the next line, and so on. If you want 2 line breaks, we have to do 2 of those, which makes it really awkward to write the body. But when we use VBA, we can just use an Alt and Enter to add a new line. So every time we press Alt Enter, we add a line. And so it looks much more like it would be in the final email. And we've got one more thing to do before we send our emails, which is to add a little button here to do the sending. Now you can go to Insert and click on Shapes, and then choose a shape like this, and then draw it out. Here's one I prepared earlier. So the important thing here is to right-click on the shape, and then go down to where it says Assign Macro. So we want to choose macros in this workbook, and we've got the level 2 emails macro. So we select that, click OK. And what that does is it assigns that macro, the VBA code we just wrote. So when I click that button, it runs a macro. There we go. We see it's creating these emails. So if we had 10 emails, 20 emails, 50 emails, it would just go through and create all of them. But what if we want to send more than just text? What if our IMF director needs to send critical documents as attachments? How do we get to do that? On level 3, it's time to learn how to add attachments. We'll extend our VBA code to handle the task, so you can go beyond simple text emails and include documents like PDFs, Excel workbooks, or text files. The first change we're going to make on our worksheet is an extra column. So in each of these cells is the full file path to the attachment we want to send. And back in the VBA editor, I'm going to open level 3. So this is the code I've written. I'm going to also open level 2 and go to Window and tile vertically so we can see them side by side. So this is useful for comparing the code, and we'll see that there's only one line of difference here, which is at the end of all these dim statements where we define the variables, we actually are going to define a new variable called attachment path, and it's going to be of a type called string, which holds text. So now let's scroll down and find where the other difference is. There's only 2 differences in these bits of code. So all of this is the same. We'll build the email in the same way with the 2 CC, BCC, subject, and body. And here is where it gets different. We're going to add an attachment. So we'll set attachment path equals to the range, which is this cell B4, and we'll offset it by the current row and 6 columns to the right. So we'll start in B4, which is this cell here, and then we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which is this column H for attachments. And we'll look in this cell here. The next line says, if that string isn't blank, then add an attachment. And the attachment to add is specified by attachment path. So we could actually make it so that there's no attachment just by deleting this. And if there's no attachment, then it will just skip over adding something and just go straight to this end if. And that is the only 2 differences. So we first declared this variable, attachment path, and then we used it to get the attachment here and add it to the email. Heading back to our workbook, let's right-click and assign the macro. We want to choose level 3 and click OK. Now, when I click off and click on again, it generates the 3 emails. And you'll notice there is an Excel workbook attached for Benji. It's the tech report that he needs. And Agent Carter gets a briefing pack. And Ethan Hunt gets a self-destruct message. Top priority. Now that's all good and fine, but what if the director needs to send more than just one attachment? The way we've currently got it, we can only send the one attachment. We need to send multiple attachments. How do we do that? On level 4, we'll find out how to send multiple attachments, and you can customize which recipients get which attachments. The question is, can VBA handle it? Let me give you a demo of how level 4 works. So if you want to include multiple attachments, you've got to separate them with a semicolon. And you've got to make sure you don't include quote marks in the file paths. For example, here is the first attachment we're going to use. C uses Ethan briefing pack.txt. And here is the semicolon that separates it from the second attachment, which is the self-destruct txt. Now we'll choose the files from Windows Explorer. This is the first one, so I'll right-click on it and click on Copy as Path. Then I head back to Excel, and in the formula bar, I'm going to press Ctrl-V to paste it. And you've got to remember to get rid of these quote marks. So I'll press backspace, and the one at the beginning as well, get rid of that. Head back to the end and include a semicolon to separate it from the next attachment, and a space. Now we head back to Windows Explorer and choose the second attachment, right-click on it, then click on Copy as Path. Now head back to Excel and Ctrl-V to paste it. Remember to get rid of these quote marks, otherwise they'll interfere with the macro, and then hit Enter. So I'll copy this one down to here, copy paste, but I'll fill this one with a different set of attachments. This time I'll include a tech report for Benji. So I'll remember to copy his path and then paste it in. And now remember to remove the quote marks at the end and at the beginning. Now hit enter. Now when I press send emails, it generates these 3 emails and you can see the correct attachments have been included. Let's take a look at level 3 code versus level 4 code over here. So the main difference at the top where we declare all these variables is these at the bottom. We've got dimension attachment array as string and dimension I as long. So that first one is actually another kind of variable called an array. And we've got these parentheses to show it. And an array is a bit like a box like this, but instead of just containing one thing, it can contain many things, like this. So an array can hold, let's say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or more items. And that's useful for when you need to work with more than a single item in a particular variable. So scrolling down, this code is identical except for where it includes this array. So in order to get and process multiple attachments, we've got to split the attachment paths using the semicolon, and we do it like this. So we've got this attachment array, we're making it equal to, we've got this function split, which takes the attachment path and it splits it using the semicolon as a delimiter. So remember before when we had the array defined as lots of little boxes inside a bigger box? Well, with this bit, we're looping through each of those boxes and adding it as an attachment. So we're starting here and we're going to the next one and the third one and the fourth one if there are. We'll go all the way until there are no more. And we'll use this for I to next I loop to do that. Just to be clear, this loops through from the lower bound, that's what L bound stands for here, L bound, to the upper bound, which is what U bound stands for, of the attachment array. And then it does .attachments.add, which actually applies to this line. So don't worry too much about this. I'll give you a download link to the file so you can take a look at this more detail for yourself later. The important thing is it goes through each of the elements in the array from the lowest to the highest, this upper bound, and then it goes and adds that as an attachment by trimming what's in that attachment array box. Then after all of the attachments are processed, we do the same as before and we send or display the email. And then after that we clean up. So we've managed to get multiple attachments in our emails, but it's a real pain to have to copy and paste the file paths. Surely there's an easier way to get our attachments in. On level 5, let's get Excel to put an attachment link straight in the cell so we don't need to copy and paste the links manually. All we need to do is extend our VBA code to do this. Here's how level 5 single attachment picker works. We click on the cell that we want to place the attachment file path in. Then we click on this button, which runs a macro, and we can choose a file and then click OK. Go to the next cell, click pick attachment, choose another attachment, and then do the same. So we'll pick tech report here, click OK. Now when we send emails, you see that Benji gets a tech report, Agent Carter gets a briefing pack, and Ethan gets a self-destruct message. Let's take a look at level 4 VBA versus level 5 VBA. I'm going to scroll down in this code window to the very bottom, and then also to the level 5 code. And if we compare those side by side, do you see any differences? Well, the answer is there's no differences because the only difference comes at the very bottom here. Let me expand the window to see clearer. So at the bottom of this module, I actually have something called sub-procedure level 5 pick attachment. So the way this VBA works is we're creating a file picker as a file dialog object, and then we're creating this string, which is called selected file. The first step is to actually create that file dialog object as a file picker. So we're going to set file picker equals application.fileDialog, and in these parentheses we see MSO file dialog file picker. That just tells Excel what kind of file dialog we want to open. Next, we're going to show the dialog box. So if filepicker.show equals -1, then that means the user's selected file. And we're going to go and change the value of selected file, which was a string we defined up here. So that selected file becomes filepicker.selectedItems1. And that means it's going to get the first selected file, and then it's going to insert the file path into the active cell. So selected file now contains the file path that we chose, and it's going to put it into the active cell value. So active cell is the cell we've picked and which is selected in Excel. .value means the value of that cell, and it's going to change to the file path in selected file. And then finally, we'll just return the file picker object to nothing. So back in Excel, we need to make sure we attach the right macro to this pick attachment button. To do that, just right click on this shape and then click on assign macro, and we choose macros in this workbook, and it was level 5 pick attachment. Click OK. And now we can use the pick attachment button to populate this cell. There's the file dialog box, and we click OK, and it adds the file path there. But of course, the IMF director probably wants to attach more than one attachment. So how do we update this to make it more powerful and do multiple attachments? On level 6, we'll change the way that the file picker works. Instead of just adding the file path for one attachment, it'll add the file paths for multiple attachments. Let's see it in action. So I'm going to select this cell here, and then I'm going to click on Pick Attachments. Now this brings up the same dialog box as in level 5, but now I can click on one attachment and then press Ctrl and select another one. Or I can click on the first one, press Shift, and click on the last one, and that will send 3 attachments. So when I click OK, you see it auto-populates this cell with the file paths for 1, 2, and 3 attachments. Then we can go ahead and send the emails with all the attachments. So let me go and populate this one. I'll choose Briefing Pack, hold Control with Tech Report, click OK. And then this one, the same, I'll pick attachments, click on Briefing Pack and hold Control, then click on Tech Report and click OK. Now I'll click Send Emails, and we see Benji got the Briefing Pack with Tech Report. Agent Carter got Briefing Pack and Tech Report, and Ethan got Briefing Pack, Self-Destruct Message, and Tech Report. So inside the Visual Basic Editor, let's compare the level 5 Pick Attachment macro on the left with the level 6 Pick Attachment macro on the right. So you see it's about twice as long because there's an extra section down here which loops through all selected items and removes the trailing semicolon and space, then inserts that into the active cell. So let's take a look at it from the top. First, we have this dim I as integer. That creates a variable called I, and integer just means a whole number. So we use that down here in this loop. So we're going to go through all of these selected items in the dialog box, and we're going to loop through them and then add the file paths so that we can later write them to the active cell. Before that happens though, there's something that we do with the file picker, which is we allow the multi-select to be true. So this line enables multiple file selection. Now, as before, we're going to have to show the dialog box, which is what happens here. And then after that, we loop through all the selected items. I'm going to scroll a little bit to the right so we can see this better. So the important lines are here. For I equals 1 to .selectedItems.count. So that's going to count how many items were selected in the dialog box. Let's say there were 3 files. Then it's going to say selected files, so that's the string that has the file paths. We're going to say that equals what it was before, so the same name, selected files, and selected items. So this I inside parentheses is the count of the item. And then we're going to add at the end a semicolon and a space. So let me show you how this looks. Let's say we had the first file, file 1. So as we go around this loop, selected files is nothing, so it's blank. But we've got selected items 1, which is file 1. So we're going to go file 1, and we're going to add to that a semicolon at the end. So semicolon, and then a space. So then it goes round and loops. Remember, we're going to have 3 files in this. So I was 1. When it goes to this line, next I then becomes 2. So selected files equals selected files, which is what's here, and selected items 2. In this case, it's file 2. So that's the full file path for file 2. And then it's going to add the semicolon and a space. And then it's going to go to the next I, which is 3, because we have 3 files. So it's going to change selected file to be file1, semicolon, file2, semicolon, and file3, semicolon, space. Now notice what happens. At the end of this, we have an extra semicolon and space that we don't need. So this part here actually removes this last semicolon and space. And after that's done, we just insert the value into the active cell. And we get on with the rest of the macro, which is basically just message box to say no files were selected if the user didn't pick any files. And then we clear the file picker object. And this extra part here with looping through the selected items and removing the trailing semicolon and space, that's what allows us to pick multiple attachments. We now have a versatile solution, but it's missing one thing. The IMF director wants to include this Excel range inside the email body so we can send this table with potential threats to his agents. How do we automatically add this Excel range to our emails? On level 7, we'll modify our VBA code so we can send personalized emails with multiple attachments and a table of summary data that's copied from Excel. Let's go. How this works is we'll pick our attachments, then we'll pick the range, then we'll click send emails. I'll fast forward the bit about picking attachments because we cover that in level 6. And now it's time to pick our range. So I click here and I'll move to the data sheet, select this table, and then click OK. And that's the data range that we're going to use inside the email. Copy it down with Control D, and now click Send Emails. And so you see, we have the attachments and we have the threat table. And you'll notice that the formats and fonts are retained. So here I have level 6 VBA, and on the right I have level 7 VBA. And what I want to do is show you that level 6 VBA has these 2 subroutines. If you click this drop down, you'll see level 6 emails with multi-attachment picker, and then level 6 pick attachments. But on the right, level 7 has these 3 subroutines. So emails with data from range, and then level 7 pick attachments, and level 7 pick range. But it also has these 3 functions. So the first one is color to hex, the second one is convert cell to HTML, and the third one is range to HTML. Now, unfortunately, I don't have the scope in this video to explain all of this and how it works, but I will show you an overall system diagram. You'll find this diagram inside the module called Level 7 Diagram. And you can download this whole workbook with all the VBA code in it from the link in the description below. The main subroutine is this level 7 emails with data from range. So that's the same as level 6, except for this part where we get the data range. Now, we use functions which we call from this main subroutine. And the first one of these is function range to HTML. So it takes the cell range that you give it, and it turns that into an HTML table. So it keeps the formatting. The second function that it uses is this convert cell to HTML. So that formats a single cell content to HTML, which we use for the main body text. And that function actually uses a third function called color to hex, just to convert the color to a hex string, and so we can keep the color intact. So as well as this main subroutine, there are 2 more down here. The first is to help pick attachments. It will select and insert the attachment path into the active cell. And the second is to pick the range. So this selects and inserts the range address into the active cell. So once we get the active cell populated with the range address, there's a whole bunch of new things we do. So call function range to HTML, call function convert cell to HTML, and then replace range inside these curly brackets with the HTML table, where this range thing is a placeholder. So we replace the placeholder with the HTML table, and then we send the email like before. So let me walk through this part C on screen in Excel. So let's start with this first line here. We're going to call range to HTML. So on the spreadsheet on the right, we specify the range here. It goes to this range, which is on the data tab, and then it selects this table and it converts it into HTML format so that it retains the row heights, column widths, and the font sizing and coloring. Then this second line here, convert cell to HTML. That looks inside the body and it takes the text inside the cell and turns that into HTML. And then the third line here, which is replace range with HTML in email body, what that does is it looks for the word range, this placeholder text, with the curly brackets on the left and the right, and then it replaces that with the HTML table that was in the data range here. So this table as HTML gets put into the message in place of where it says range. And that's how we get this table put into the email. Mission success! You've seen how to use VBA to automate emails, but that's not all it can do. It can also get rid of even more of your repetitive tasks, and it will help you to get back hours every day. And the best part, it's now 10 times easier than ever before to learn it. So watch this video next to find out how.